I hope everyone's having a nice kind of end to their summer. It's kind of hard to believe, at least for me, that my kids are starting school again in like less than 2 weeks. So I see some fist bumps from Hannah. Yeah.
Only like 3 more days for Portland Public Schools.
Oh, is that right? I didn't realize Portland.
Yeah.
Yeah, but kindergarten's a whole week later. So the little
Yeah.
one is still going to
Really?
be here.
Are your kids excited to go back to school? Maybe some mixed.
We didn't do the camp roulette this year. We just kept them home. So they're so bored and so ready to not be bored anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think mine are kind of in the same position too. We similarly didn't do the camp circuit, so I think there'll be kind of mixed feelings. A little bit, not have the freedom to do whatever they want all day, but also it'll be nice to have something to do, a little bit more structure. Okay, well, I think we're kind of at a good mass of attendees here, and so I think we can go ahead and kick off the meeting. Like I said before, this is the August 21st meeting of the Building Performance Standards Rulemaking Advisory Committee. So we're kind of nearing the end of our Rulemaking Advisory Committee work. We really just have one more RAC meeting scheduled in 2 weeks, and then we've got a public meeting scheduled, and we'll kind of talk over the final timeline at the end of the meeting today too, as we discuss next steps. But the purpose of the meeting today is in terms of number of items on the agenda, pretty short, really just two things. But the main item that we are going to work through will be to have the SBW team and our consultants discuss the energy use intensity average analysis, which informs the target setting work that we're going about right now to set the targets for the building performance standards. So that'll be the main thing, and then that'll cover about right now the agenda is about an hour and a half of the 2-hour meeting to talk about that. Although if there's good discussion, we certainly don't want to cut anything short. If there's a lot of good comments and feedback from the RAC on that. The main reason for this meeting, it was specially scheduled just to discuss the energy use targets. So that's kind of the reason we're here today. And then if there is some time at the end, we'll cover the appendix for Tier 1 covered buildings reporting requirements. That one was on the last meeting's agenda too, that we ran out of time. It's on this one again too. If we don't get to it today, we'll push it off to the final meeting on September 4th. And that's been in the SharePoint site that is available for review and comment right now if you'd like also. So I think with that, unless there's are there any questions or any suggested changes to the agenda for today? Okay, hearing none, I will go ahead and just turn it over to the SBW team. I think Anna, you plan to share your screen?
I do.
And presentation? Okay.
Yeah. And as we learned last time, one small thing about me sharing my screen is that then I can't see my WebEx screen. And so we'll end up, I'll go on mute when I'm done with my piece, but then if you ask me any follow-up questions, it will take me a second. Okay. So I am pulling up that application right now to share. All right, y'all should be good. What we're going to be talking today is the next step in target development, and that is the creation of the means. One reminder, I know a lot of us don't use WebEx every day. If you have the app or if you're using the web browser, it should look similar to this. You've got your mute options, your video options. The chat is an important place. We do collect all of the chats that come through later. We do analyze them. We do talk about them. We can do follow-up if necessary, if there are questions that we can't get to, but we are monitoring that chat. We are also monitoring the hand raises. There are two places where you can do that, over in reactions or on your own name in the participants list. Just like last time, we are really looking for feedback here. That is the purpose of these meetings for on our end at least. And so please feel free to jump in when you need to. So as Blake said, we intend to take about an hour and a half here to get us through this big conversation on where the means are looking, what additional information is going to be needed to collect, and then how that's going to influence the target setting that we're going to be covering in a couple of weeks here. This is an extremely fast process. As y'all know, it has only been a month since our last conversation where we talked to you about what the methodology would look like at a holistic level, introduce the concepts of the means, the data sets that we'll be using, that we are using, the additional data that might get brought in at different times. And we talked about that kind of like policy alignment process that gets us towards those final targets. It has only been a month, and now we are in the August meeting where we are going to talk to you about the calculated EUIs. We're going to show you a variety of different EUIs that have been calculated for different specific building categories, and also kind of go over them at a holistic level before going into more of the details of the target settings more. And then our next meeting is a combo meeting. It's going to be the RAC and it's a public meeting. This is where we are going to be really talking about those targets in much more detail. We'll be presenting the final means at that point, in addition to the draft targets that we're putting together. Because we have such a short timeline, I do want to kind of reiterate how much we need your feedback really quickly after this meeting. Very soon after the meeting, within an hour or so, I'll have a survey sent to Blake that he can disseminate to all of you that'll give you a formal avenue to provide feedback on the means and the process if need be. And you could also feel free to reach out directly to him or directly to us with your feedback. But we are hoping to get that feedback, no joke, by Friday. Just because this process is so fast, we're going to need to have those targets created halfway through the very first week of September to get in your hands for review. Then after that, we'll have another public meeting, could be another after that, to try to finalize this process and get those final rules out. With that, I am going to hand this over to Poppy, and she is going to walk us through kind of the rest of the methodology. Poppy sent me an email. She is muted externally. Can we promote her to a panelist?
Poppy is currently a panelist. I'm not sure why she's unable to unmute. Abby, are you able to see any reason?
Most I can do is send her a request for her to unmute. I'm not able to do it for her.
Okay. Are any of the other panelists able to?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask Santiago to come in her stead, and then if Poppy is able to, then she can take over the conversation. But otherwise, Santiago, I'll be in charge of slides, and you can be in charge of words.
All right, you got it. Thanks, Anna. Poppy, interrupt me anytime if you get your sound on. Okay, so we'll be going over a recap of some of the initial input we got from the RAC, and we'll also do a quick review of our means development process, some general assumptions in our methodology, additional considerations which we built into our analysis, but I think are open for some questions and maybe some adjustments where the data allows. And we'll cover the analysis data frames used to develop those means and some tentative approaches for comparing the different data sets to pick the appropriate means to represent the region. Let's head on to the next slide to recap the input. So things that we were asked to do, point out where means are significantly different in Oregon compared to Washington and or national data sets. And then also, how do building mean EUIs from the pre-COVID era to the post-COVID era compare due to changes in occupancy. We'll address some of this later on in the presentation, so if you don't hear about it right away, just hold on, and we can talk about it at a juncture where it comes up in the deck. All right. Yeah,
Santiago,
Poppy,
I'm
you're
back
back.
now. Yeah. All right. So just picking off where Santiago, just picking up where he left off. To provide some framing for this, I think it'll be helpful to just recap what these key steps are, because it'll give you an idea of how to wrap your heads around these various data sets and means that Santiago is about to present. So just to confirm, at our last meeting, we received some initial input when we presented the methodology, and we have been incorporating that input, and we plan on addressing it within the context of the means development and target development. But now we're in the process of updating the regional means. And so this is the step where we create a regionally appropriate set of means, which is actually what we used for the Washington BPS. And we didn't actually have to make any adjustments for Washington to that regional mean for all of the building types. And partly that's because of when we were doing it in the process, because it was in 2020 and we had very recent regional data. And also Washington is a very large part of the region. And Oregon is the second largest part, it's about 30% of the region. So this regional data is fairly representative of Oregon itself. But we do need to update it with the 2018 CBEX data, which is the national data. So this is the first step, is a regional means. This is something that would be appropriate for any state in the Pacific Northwest, the 4 states, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And then we will take the regional mean, and then we'll do this additional calibration where we take into consideration Portland specific data, maybe even some other newer data that's coming from the city of Seattle, maybe some schools data. So that all gets taken into consideration in the second step, which is that calibration of the regional means. So a lot of what Santiago is about to present, the methodology assumptions, and a lot of means is really in this second square where we're looking at updating the regional means. And that mainly relates to the CBSA data and this national CBEX data. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand things back to Santiago to discuss things in more detail.
Thank you, Poppy. We'll go over some of the assumptions in our methodology. So first and foremost, the building taxonomies. We lean on the CBEX taxonomies, which are similar to the ASHRAE 100 taxonomies for buildings. And this is important because we have data available for multiple types of, for example, offices. Offices actually breaks into multiple types. I think we have 4 that show up in this slide deck, and there are other subsets, within those. So we use these taxonomies to draw the data sets together, and where we're able to, we align them between CBSA and CBEX and other data sets. We've had good success aligning with some types in Portland benchmarking as well. So those taxonomies are key for our definitions here. And that's each mean EUI is calculated for each building within that taxonomy. We also use representative climate zones, or we try to. CBEX has a limited data set within 4C and 5B and on the West Coast. So one of the methods which we proposed and which we plan to use is to adapt the CBEX climate data using ASHRAE ratios to make them fit within the 4C and 5B EUIs so that they can be used to roll up and give us more data points that we can use. Further, we limit the floor areas that we use in our analysis. Many of these buildings in the CBEX and CBSA datasets have square footages below 10,000 square feet. 10,000 is not a magic number, but we have found that there are significant differences in a few types of buildings, EUIs, above and below that threshold. So to make things representative for the buildings which have to comply with this law, we filter out buildings below 10,000 square feet. There are exceptions. Some building types just don't have very many buildings above that size. Restaurants come to mind, not a lot of 10,000 square foot restaurants. So we apply some filtering there. The data frames we look at include CBSA. So CBSA is the regional benchmarking for commercial, or regional data set collected for commercial buildings. And we use data from 2009 up through the most recent iteration of CBSA. CBEX will use exclusively 2018 CBEX for now, unless there are strong needs to go to 2012. So that survey was completed in 2018 and published a few years back. And that also forms a major part of the data frames we'll be analyzing. Another frame for consideration, which we'll talk about later and how it might be used, will be the Portland benchmarked buildings. So the way that the means are calculated, for each of these data sets, we use the total annual energy consumption, weather normalized where possible, and the total applicable floor area, intending to subtract out non-conditioned spaces for the building. So we wouldn't want to include parking garages, for example, in those floor areas. And then the EUI is just the ratio of the total energy to square footage, total energy being calculated in kBTUs. So the EUIs will all be in kBTUs per square foot. When we compare these means, we have to find a way to say this is the best mean to select, or it's the most representative mean. We aim to select buildings that have at least 5 data points in the sample. And that's part of why we go through efforts to include additional buildings in CBEX to make sure that we have enough buildings in a few of these categories. Additionally, when we calculate the means, we calculate the relative standard error of those means to figure out how close the buildings are to each other. We prefer to select buildings that have a relative error of less than or equal to 15%. There are some additional considerations here, which I'll go over. So there is one mean that we intend to calculate for each climate zone and building type. And we have ways of breaking those apart into climate zones after we've calculated the means. EUIs will be blind to space heating fuel. That information is partially in there, but to get enough buildings in each of these categories, we can't be subdividing very much. So we'll keep things to just the kBTU per square foot, blind to whether they use gas or electric heat. Regarding vintages, again, not wanting to subdivide buildings further, we don't propose to calculate a separate EUI for newer vintages. However, there are methods which could be applied to approximate a mean for those vintages, but that won't be part of the means calculation process. The mean is just something calculated from the whole data set. EUIs won't be separated by size. I alluded to this earlier, but there won't be any distinction between large or medium offices. It'll just be an administrative office or a government office, something like that. So just one brief update on the climate adjustment factor. In 2012 CBEX, we were able to use these adjustment factors by approximating climate zone from cooling degree day and heating degree days. We're doing something different in 2018 at the recommendation of the Energy Information Administration and national labs, who suggest that we use grouped climate zones. So CBEX 2018 groups climate zones according to just the number. So you have, for example, instead of 6A, B, and C, you have just zone 6. So we'll be grouping them by that methodology which they've outlined. And then we apply the ASHRAE climate adjustment factors, which were part of the ASHRAE 100 guideline, which was developed. Just a note here, approximately 13% of the buildings in CBEX 2018 had their climate zones hidden for privacy. So this is something that CBEX takes great pains to do with many of their buildings to protect user information or protect participant information. These aren't applicable to the climate adjusted process which we use, but they are still usable as a mean on their own. So right now, there are no climate adjustments for about 13% of these buildings. That was a lot of information. I'll just pause for a moment, see if there are any questions. We can, of course, have more time for questions later, but while it's fresh on your mind, now is a good time. Okay, we'll take that 5-second pause and move on. So a little bit of comparison between the 2012 and 2018 CBEX data frames. Right here we have the total means for each of these categories. These are not climate adjusted. There are, however, some filters applied for applicability. You can see that there are some differences here. You know, the eye tells us that there are observable differences. You know, one notable one might be fast food. You know, you can see that that had a higher mean from 2012 and 2018. It's important to note that not all of these changes are statistically significant. CBEX only had something on the order of 6,500 buildings in their 2018 data. And it was a similar number for 2012. Means work pretty well when they show the adjustments at kind of more broad categories. So offices in general, for example, as opposed to administrative offices and government offices. So while there are some changes for, excuse me, some statistically significant changes for a handful of buildings, I think that's around 4. Overall, there are trends that show that the means are going down, but we can't say that that's true for every specific building type. So that leads us to some later parts of our analysis where we try to make that decision of, is this really going down or not, or is it going up? Okay, let's move on to another point of comparison. So CBSA, and I apologize for the coloring here. Green and blue looks pretty to us, but I realize it might be challenging for some folks. So here we have comparisons between the full CBSA data frame and the 2018 CBEX data frame, which we are using in our analysis. We can see that some of these are quite close. You know, a few of those categories, you know, look like they could be from the same data set. And then some of these others are very different. You know, I'll call your attention to restaurant, cafeteria, other food service, post office, and so on. Again, important to note that not all of these differences are statistically significant. CBSA is a great data frame. It has something on the order of 2,000 buildings when we combine all the data sets together, but that's, you know, about a third of what we get out of CBEX. So not all of these differences are statistically significant. And you can see a few categories where CBSA doesn't have any data at all, notably laboratory and refrigerated warehouse. So again, part of this process is we consider all of these means together, look at the variance, not variance, the deviation within an individual mean, and that helps us decide which of these are tight and representative for the region. Okay, let's move on. So just a few points of comparison here, for some very specific types of buildings. We have, pretty good matches here for a lot of the education types of buildings. It is important to note that colleges and universities are one of the buildings that CBEX obfuscated all climate data for. So we don't know where a single college is in the CBEX data set. We could probably guess, but they didn't provide that information. So what you see here is an actual mean across the whole data set. It's not climate adjusted, and all of these data are not climate adjusted. So some of these look close, and I think if you think later on in our process, we're likely to select one or these others with great confidence because they're close to each other. Others, like college or university, require some additional consideration of what's an appropriate mean. I'll pause for a second in case education buildings are particularly important to anybody, but the data for all buildings is in the slide above.
I would
All right.
just mention
Yeah.
quickly, Santiago, also that education, for example, is one of the building types in the 2018 CBEX that was statistically significant in its reduction. So it was inpatient healthcare, outpatient healthcare, office, and education. So those kind of broad categories. And so this is an example we can see there. The 92 EUI for the green CBEX represents a reduction from 2018 to 2012.
Thank you, Poppy. We have a couple more categories here, so we'll move on to them, and I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions. So we'll move to the next category just for quick coverage here. We're not going to go over all of the categories. We just have a sample for your consideration here. Again, food sales and service. So we have grocery/food market. So that would be, your supermarkets, but could also include, smaller bodegas, things like that, as long as they meet the requirements for a grocery store. And we see decent alignment between these two, at least when we're not applying additional filtering of any kind. Restaurant cafeteria, we do see a bit of a difference here. And again, we'd want to use the interval of the error estimation to see, is that really a good value to pick? And I think if I recall correctly, CBSA's spread for restaurant and cafeteria is quite large. So in this case, CBEX might be a better choice. But that's not a promise. That's just an observation looking at this slide. I'll pause for a moment. We can move on. Retail, again, we see pretty good alignment here. Vehicle dealership, showroom, maybe not as much. And I think a thing to note here is that while CBSA and CBEX do follow, very high standards for developing their building taxonomies, they weren't always 100% aligned. CBEX is actually CBSA is the more senior data set here. If we include buildings going back as far as 2009, it's worth noting that some of those definitions may have shifted slightly over time. I can't imagine a ton of changes to vehicle dealerships specifically, but it's worth noting that. Let's move on. Healthcare, again, reasonable alignment for hospital, inpatient health. Again, hospitals are another of those CBEX categories without the specific climate data, but it is encouraging to see that the mean across the whole category is actually very, very close to CBSA. So that's one that we could probably pick with reasonable confidence. Maybe less so for outpatient health and medical office and nursing homes. These will require more careful review of the error bounds to make sure we're picking something representative for the region. I'll pause for a moment. Okay, and we can move on. Offices are something we're all very interested in. And, again, Poppy noted that this is one of the CBEX building types, the broad category of office, where reductions were significant over the last CBEX survey. You know, we see correspondingly that some of these categories have actually decreased a little bit compared to CBSA. Well, decreased compared to CBEX 2012 and are lower than CBSA. Okay, so we'll move on to the last slide here of this section. And I just want to frame this as this isn't the decision that we have made. This is a decision which we are, or this is a process we are proposing and we would like additional feedback on. We found this worked quite well for Washington to help find appropriate means for the region. There could be additional steps or gates or selection criteria added, which we'll talk to you about in a little bit. But for Washington, this is what the process looked like. So in order of priority, if we found that there was no mean EY available in CBSA, laboratories, which I called out earlier, are a case there, we would default to picking CBEX. It's basically the only data set available, so we go with the best information that we have. The red bar represents, you know, where we adjust to if we need to make an adjustment. And the gray bar represents, you know, what we might have selected as the mean. And that is what we did in Washington. It could be what we do here. In this second category, we have the example of the CBSA relative error is less than the CBEX relative error, and the population of buildings is greater than 5, and the CBSA relative error is less than 15%. In that case, we would lean on the CBSA mean as the mean that we would choose to represent the region. So you can see there again, we select the CBSA data, and the gray bar would be the mean that comes up. And then this last category, CBSA's relative error is greater than the CBEX relative error. So you can see that blue bar's error bound. So that's the whisker that you see on the top of the bar is quite large compared to the CBEX error bar. So we would have more confidence in the CBEX mean there. But in acknowledgement that the CBSA data is probably still a better representation of the region, we would nudge that EUI up just a little bit in this case by the difference in the error boundary. So we would go up to the top of that whisker, and that would be the mean that we would propose there. So again, I'll emphasize these are not the means that we are claiming are true for Oregon. This is part of the process which we would use to properly select the means that represent the region. And these are 3 steps which we are proposing. More steps could be added and steps could be taken out, and additional data could be added for consideration.
Santiago,
Yes, of course.
A raised hand here.
Let's see.
I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, let's take a question.
On case 3, I'm curious why the rule is that it would be adjusted by 1 instead of adjusted by some sort of algorithmic relationship to the relative error for the CBEX data. How did you come up with 1 as the rule?
We came up with 1 as the rule because the thinking was that if you're picking the tighter error bound, we have more confidence in that error interval and that the mean could be following anywhere within that range. So this is, yeah, it's not a fancy algorithmic approach. You know, our view is that things are more replicable if they're simple, and easier for stakeholders to understand if they're simple. You know, there could be consideration for something more sophisticated, like some kind of fancy statistical analysis approach here. I'm not a statistician. I'm an engineer, so I'd appreciate feedback there if there is a statistical method which would fit this better. But that's why we chose it then.
But it is 1 standard error, so it will be different in every case depending on what the standard error is. So it is driven by a formula that we generated for for this particular calculation.
And we'd also note that we prefer to pick a mean straight up. You know, I think it's easier to defend that most of the time. So that's why that's the case 3. If neither case 1 nor case 2 are true, we would lean towards case 3. So that's part of why too. It's the approach, and it's a small change given that case 1 and case 2 weren't possible.
Yeah, I don't believe that that was actually very common in the Washington numbers. It was something that came up just really in that particular circumstance, but it wasn't that many buildings.
I think, Poppy, just to give a number, it was on the order of 5 or 6 total buildings that needed that kind of adjustment out of approximately 50.
And one additional thing, I think that's a helpful segue into the next slides that Santiago will present. And that's that when we looked at the city of Seattle benchmarking data when we were developing the Washington targets, it was fairly well aligned with the regional data that we had developed. So we didn't actually make any adjustments based on the Seattle data. However, that might not be the case for Portland when we look at that and get to that point where we're comparing it. Some of that Portland data may come in and be the deciding factor in some of these situations. So just to kind of broaden the spectrum to some of those other considerations, it's something to keep in mind.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, let's move on, and we can, of course, come back. So just, again, some additional context setting. So here's some data from the City of Portland benchmarking data sets from 2019 and 2023. In Washington, we made a consideration for Seattle data to check alignment against the region, and I think that was it's primarily a quality assurance check. You know, does this match you know, a huge block of buildings which we know are in the correct climate zone and are in the region that we are studying. So that's one of the approaches here. You know, other considerations could be, you know, which way is the data trending? It's worth noting that the 2023 Portland benchmarking data is probably the newest of the available data sets, maybe the closest representation of where buildings are at in the region. Our cautionary note there is that, you know, Portland is not the same as Salem or, you know, Baker City. So, you know, we think it's a good representation of the region, but we would caution that using Portland benchmarking data straight up could be problematic. But we do think it is a good indication of trends, where things are going, and as a check, you know, do our regional means match up similarly? Poppy?
And one additional thing that we can look at there is that, for example, a high percentage of the commercial buildings likely are in the Portland area, but we can look and see if we can get some data on that. For example, it's not necessarily just the city of Seattle, but if you look in Washington State, the 4 counties of the Puget Sound region represent about 70% of all of the commercial floor area in Washington State. So things that are representative of that, means that are representative of that area are representing a very large portion likely of the overall square footage. Like Santiago said, they're not the same, but if we're looking at means and we're looking at an average across the state, then the Portland data could be fairly useful in trying to do the calibration, at least to make it the most representative means that they can be.
Oh, I don't see any hands raised. One last check. Any other questions? All right. We will want you to raise your hands for the next section here. Poppy, go ahead.
Yeah, so we have some time here for discussion, and we can open it up, of course, if anybody has any specific questions, either on material that was presented or not presented. We're happy to answer any questions on that or facilitate a discussion. But we also wanted to present a few discussion topics. And the first category is thinking about priority dials and data sources for the calibration. And that's really building off of the flow of the slides that Santiago just presented, but in particular looking at the Portland data and thinking about that second step in our process after we develop those regional means with the CBEX data. What kinds of things does the RAC really think are maybe the most important dials? For example, we have the desire to make it Oregon specific. So that's looking at Portland data, potentially some schools data that we have for the whole state of Oregon, maybe some other data sets if there are things available where the means are already developed and it's quality QC data. But then there's this question of ensuring that we have the most up-to-date means, and there's some crossover here. So the most up-to-date regional data we have is the CBSA, which is 2019, and then it also includes a number of previous cohorts. But that is actually now pretty similar in time frame to the 2018 CBEX data, which we didn't have when we developed the, there's a pretty decent lag in when that national data comes out. So we were using 2012 last time. So we are updating it to 2018, but still we're in 2024 and we're developing targets for 2 to 3 years from now. So having the most up-to-date means is really important. And so that's where the Portland data again will come into play because there are 2023 means, but we also may want to extend that out to looking at what are the trends in the CBEX data, and then what are the trends in, for example, the city of Seattle benchmarking data. So that could be taken into consideration. So the question really for the RAC right now is, what's kind of jumping out at you? What are your key takeaways, particularly in relation to these dials, and any questions you have or how you think that we may want to focus in on making this really relevant to the state of Oregon? So I'm going to open it up for anybody to raise their hand, or I'm not sure, Kirsten, if we want folks to just jump in, but we do have a pretty good amount of time. We have about 25 minutes for discussion before we were planning on moving on to the next section.
So Alex has a hand raised, but first there's a question in the chat. Can you review how climate zones are factored into energy use intensity?
Yes, of course. First, there is a general observation, both in CBEX and other data metadata sets like AshRate 100, which looked at CBEX data that show that even almost the same building type in a different climate zone would have different energy use intensity. That kind of makes sense when we think about, for example, 4C being a milder climate, less cold winters, less hot summers than 5B. So, one would expect HVAC to be a factor there at minimum. As part of that consideration, when we develop the means for these data sets, and the means are at a regional level first. So we calculate what the EUI is for the region, because although 4C and 5B might be somewhat different, they are still much closer together than we would see in 6B or 7, for example, or in the other direction in 1A. So, we don't want to use an EUI, which is an Alaska building or a Florida building, to represent Portland or Baker City straight up. So the way that we make those adjustments is we calculate the means after regionalizing them first. So that first step, the regional adjustment on the CBEX data, is to take the ASHRAE 100 climate zone adjustment factors, which are a statistical model that they developed for ASHRAE 100 to show basically a ratio. You see that a 1A building, for example, is, let's say, 1.5 times the UI of a 4C building. So what we do to regionalize them is we basically take those factors and we flip them. So we take that whole CBEX data set and we try to make it look like it's in 4C or 5B. And then we take the averages of those to get a regional mean EUI. Then after we've done that, after we've done these adjustments to get the regional means dialed in, we then flip it back out again, but this time to go directly to 5B. I think we actually calculated all the means by bringing them to 4C first, and then we use the ratio to create a 5B EUI. So all the means came from, basically making them into one climate region, and then we use the factors to create the 5B EUI. That was a lot. I'd be happy to dissect that further if anyone wants to jump in with more questions.
Yeah, I see Kathleen, your hand is up. I'm assuming this is a follow-up, and then Alex, we can head to you next.
Clarification and follow-up. Sorry, I don't have it fresh in my head. Maybe you reviewed what C versus B is.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Clarify that.
Yeah. So 4C is the mixed marine mild climate west of the Cascades. So that would include Portland, Seattle, Bellingham, and so on. Basically everything west of the Cascades. And then as far south as I think Oregon is the farthest south it goes. There might be a little tiny bit in Northern California, but 4C is mostly that region along the I-5 corridor between Oregon and Washington. And then climate zone 5B is the climate zone for Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon. There is a tiny bit of one other climate zone in northeastern Washington. It's very, very small, and we effectively neglect it in this analysis. And as far as I know, Oregon is almost completely 5B east of the Cascades.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, is there any thought? Okay, so you're averaging the two. I mean, is there any concern about issues with that being sort of more in favor of one zone versus the other, central versus western part of the state, or sorry, central and eastern versus western part of the state? Or, I mean, have you looked at it enough granularity to see that there's averaging it is sufficient for that fairness, I guess?
Yeah, great question, Kathleen. And the CBSA sample does lean a little bit more heavily west of the Cascades if we're looking at the CBSA data set. Sorry, where was I going with that? We found that the means, if we look at just the whole cluster of like maybe a very broad group of building types, that there is a difference in the EUIs. There might be some additional weight towards buildings because of that in the area west of the Cascades. We think if we're thinking of in terms of representation of the region, it's still pretty close. But I think it is a fair point that there might be some underrepresentation of the means east of the Cascades in climate zone 5B.
Thanks for that explanation, Santiago. Appreciate it.
Awesome. And next, there are some questions in the chat, but we'll go to Alex next with your hand up.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I have a question for the data that was presented, but a quick follow-up on the climate zone piece, so I make sure we understand that properly. So the goal is to develop 2 targets, right, for each climate zone. And it sounds like the only way to get there is by aggregating the data, then developing the factor, and basically one climate zone is a factor of the other climate zone. And my question there is that the same factor for all building types, or is that based on building types so that the factor can be differently? And really the background, I think, is similar to what Kathleen is saying, like, and what we were saying too, like we have lots of data on the west side, right? That's also where most of our buildings are, but those are 2 reasons I think that we want to have an, like be as accurate as we can on the 5B, right? So that there's no, imbalance basically. If we have fewer buildings, fewer data, but we want to make sure we're accurate in the western and the eastern climate zones.
Yeah, Alex. And I'll just clarify first on the factors that are used to break those climate zones apart. ASHRAE developed something on the order of, I think, maybe it was 16 or 20 factors. So it's broadly by a slightly less detailed building type. So, all offices, for example, would be together in one type, and then healthcare, I think, would all be clustered together similarly. Education would all be clustered similarly. But each of them, each of those categories would have their own climate zone adjustment factor. So, and if you think back to the charts that we were looking at earlier for those groups of buildings, one way to think about it is each of those charts would have its own climate adjustment factor, which is specific to that type of building, and that was part of the ASHRAE 100 method. To get to your other concern, we like the representation, of the 4C buildings. However, one other approach could be to calculate a mean straight down the middle, between the climate zones, for example. Like we could get an average of, this is just a thought, but you could have an average of both climate zones, right? You could take that approach for both 4C and 5B, create an average of those, and then go through the splitting. And that way you'd be adding more weight to those 5B zones. So that sort of approach is possible.
Okay. I think I follow. So thanks for that. And then just real quick, you alluded to that, I think, to earlier you were saying that how do you think what's the impact by grouping climate zones and building size? Just order of magnitude, is there significance there? I know we're limited in the data that's available, but I was curious, when you talked about some data is rather normalized, others not. We're grouping buildings together. So all of this seems like, okay, it's getting less and less granular. How confident are we that by doing that, we're still getting good outcomes? I know that's a pretty broad question, but if you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I do. So I think one of the best ways that we can test that is to look at the statistical fit of a group of building types. If there really is like a wide ranging, set of outcomes, when you apply those climate zone factors, you would expect like bigger spread in the statistical data. We found that when you do that, you do end up with reasonable fits a lot of the time. So that's one thing that gives us confidence. But I think it's a worthwhile consideration, that we could perhaps investigate. Alex, I don't know if I answered both of your questions. I might have only gotten to one. Could you rephrase the second one?
Well, really, it's about. I think you did answer it. I was just curious by grouping climate zones, right? I'm assuming that's A, B, and C. Which again gets to our conundrum that we do want to separate between C and B, even though it's different climate zones, and building size. We're also mentioning offices, right? All offices are lumped together. I don't have the understanding whether smaller offices have a significantly different UI than larger offices. But do you feel like it gets less meaningful, the data, by making those groupings? Or do you think what's what we have, that's what we have to work with?
Yeah, I think that's my biggest concern is that, when we use I think we could probably get really good statistical fits if we only picked like the 5 best represented buildings in each of these data sets, but then we'd be stuck, in our process for and I would also note that it's maybe not completely fair to all building owners either, because I think if you look at healthcare is a great example. Like if we were to group all of healthcare together, we'd be putting hospitals together with like medical diagnostic offices. And, your air changes per hour in a hospital are very different from a medical diagnostic office. So I think, I see your point that, there might be challenges to doing all of these things to create bigger data sets for these smaller groups of buildings. But I think it's a necessary action when we consider that many of these buildings, even within a grouping, can be quite different.
Yeah, I guess I'd just chime in a little bit here too. I think these are all really important considerations and points. But we're also, looking across a lot of different studies over the years. The building type is one of the most kind of important determinants of energy use. And so you take into consideration the climate, that makes some adjustments, but it's usually not huge, particularly between the 2 climate zones that we're talking about. So commercial buildings are surprisingly similar in their energy use once you're within the type. That said, we are trying to group things at the smallest level of detail that we can. It's just that a lot of these data sets, even the large, really robust data sets, aren't at that level of detail. So for example, CBSA doesn't even have categories based on, the sample isn't separated based on state. It's actually for the entire region. But that's also partly because the energy use is so determined by the building type. And then there's another consideration. So for example, we're not actually grouping buildings into the climate zone areas and looking at those. We're taking all of the buildings and applying that factor. So the climate zone factor is really having a big impact on adjusting for the type of changes in energy use that you would see in those various regions. And that's based on a really pretty elaborate and well-sourced analysis that I believe NREL did. Santiago, was it NREL that did the climate adjustment? Yeah.
Yeah, the climate zone adjustments. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are all things to consider, is that it's mostly building type, and then for climate zone, we're applying those factors. And we really feel that that's getting it to the closest, most relevant means that we can with the available data.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. And then our next question here is from Dave. So is there an option to illustrate the climate zone factor equation so folks can see it visually explained?
Like can we do it in our write-up? Yes. I think the best visual representation that I could give you just right now is to find the climate zone adjustment factor paper, which I think was co-published by NREL and ASHRAE. But the simple description, I'll try to use as few words as possible and just make kind of outline what it is. So if you have a building, say in zone 1A, you can take the factor to convert the ratio of the factors in that methodology to go from 1A to 4C, right? So the ratio of those 2 factors multiplied by that building's EY will then give you the approximate EY for that building in zone 4C. And then you can reverse it by just flipping the factor and going in the other direction. That's the simple explanation.
And as Santiago mentioned, that's at the building type level. So it's really looking at how weather would affect an office building versus a school versus public assembly. So it's really a nice mix of those two most important determinants of energy use.
Awesome. So Dave, feel free to jump in or comment if you want to follow up on that, but I'll move on to a question here from Clark. So how is all this information and the methodology going to be communicated to the public during the public meeting, knowing that there's all these acronyms, the climate zone methodology, it's all really wonky. So what efforts are going to be made to demystify these things when we move it to the public meeting?
I think I'll take the first crack at that, and then Santiago, you can jump in. Yes, we definitely need to demystify. We were taking a little bit of liberties for the RAC, kind of trying to dig in a little bit on the technical side of things and get that level of input from you all. But I think once we get to the public meeting, we'll really be looking at presenting the means that we're proposing as a result of this process. So a lot of this upstream information of the breakdown of all of these different means that are considered and the kind of statistical considerations, we'll definitely be communicating what that was, but we'll be doing it in a much more kind of rolled up, higher level way that is more accessible to the general public. We've put you not in the category of just the average bear. So, but definitely good point on the acronyms. And if there are any other pieces, for example, it sounds like the climate zone adjustments, things like that, we need to be have a simpler way to present that. Definitely open to any other particular input on areas where we can make this more accessible.
I think this is Blake. I would just kind of reiterate that and echo it too for the needs for the public meeting in September. That I think it'll definitely be important that we are able to show the public as they're reviewing it, like how we got to where we are at that point. Kind of like Poppy said, we're kind of a little bit more in the weeds now with that development and like as part of the process, how we get from these potential averages across the data sets and settle on the ultimate means for the target. But being able to have a concise way to explain how we got there, I think will be important too.
Okay, great. Also, I don't know if others can hear this. I feel like I beep every time I go on and off mute, but you're not. Okay, awesome. And Alex, I see your hand again. I don't know if this is a new hand or I think it's a new hand.
It is, and I apologize if you spoke to that already, but maybe can you again let us know what do we do with the pre or the post-COVID data, right? So specifically office, right? We have lower occupancy in office buildings post-COVID, more working from home. So I'm assuming I don't know actually, do we see a difference in EUIs pre and post-COVID? And then, yeah, what do we do with that? Because we kind of need to predict a little bit, is that going to remain the same or do we, yeah, just curious if there's any methodology in adjusting for that.
Poppy, I might just jump on this real quick and
Sure.
let you follow up. So in terms of the pre-post COVID adjustments, the big data frames that we have, the high quality frames, which have the best statistical representation in them, so that's CBEX and CBSA. The last data point collected was in CBSA in 2019, so that was just before the pandemic, and we actually started this work, during the pandemic. So I mean, it was what it was. But in terms of data that actually represents, that change or that could represent that change, I think the best examples we would have there would be the Portland benchmarking data for a big cluster of buildings with the last data point collected in 2023. The one caution that I would provide there is that we can only provide maybe an overall trend by broad categories. And it is a possibility for calibration, but for individual building EUIs, it'd be a challenging set to use. So that's what I'll say about that and pass it to Poppy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that basically is a really good outline. And for the Portland data, we'd be looking at, or just in general, I mean, the main point is that I don't think that we have the basis to make that adjustment at the regional data level. So that will probably not have that reflected in it unless we can find enough information across the region where we feel like we might feel justified in making that adjustment at that regional means level. So it'll really be more in the calibration where we're looking at how do we make adjustments to make this the most relevant for Oregon. And so we would definitely be looking at the Portland data, but this is a question for the RAC. If we're looking at something more like trends having to do with COVID or just trends over time, is that something that you would want to be looking at, for example, the Seattle data as well? How are we seeing things across these kind of, it's in the Pacific Northwest, but it's not right in Oregon, but maybe it gives a sense of the pandemic impact. And if we're developing a factor that we can apply, so it's not that we're finding the answer for Oregon necessarily, but we're trying to understand the trends in the data enough to develop a factor that we could then apply as part of the calibration. Alex or anybody, do you have any thoughts on whether or not you would be interested in bringing in some of those other data sets from other parts of the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, and since I'm still unmuted, maybe I start. The answer is like that. It seems to me initially like more information and context is better to, since we don't have, like really clear cut, here's the data, this is what the means are, but there's some interpretation and some generalization or so. I think showing more context on where the giving specifically, like COVID and changes in building occupancy, I from my personal perspective, I think we would benefit from getting more context. Other than that, I appreciate you answering my question. Thank you.
So just a quick time check. I think we have a few more minutes here before we go on to the next section where we discuss the targets update more. Unless there's any other questions now, we can certainly go over a little bit. But Kirsten, is there anybody else that's waiting to ask questions?
Oh, actually, Alex and Clark have their hands up.
Yeah, I was going to build on what you and Alex were just talking about. My sense is that including Seattle at least would be helpful for context, as Alex said, but especially on a longer term methodology, understanding north-south implications to building performance in climate zone, I think is going to matter as we see the effects of climate change, happen over time. And right now, Oregon's weather differentials or climate differentials are largely east-west. They're not entirely east-west, but there's a lot of east-west differential, and having a north-south data set for similar climate seems helpful.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So you're saying that at least in that climate zone, that it seems pretty relevant to be looking at the Seattle data, and then it's also maybe similar building sector markets, real estate markets, certainly more similar than comparing like Miami.
Right, but I would also think
You know?
the same would hold true for Bend and Spokane as Portland and Seattle, and it seems like that would be a valuable kind of data check for you, for all of us, but for your work. Thanks.
All right, well, if we don't have any other questions now, I think we'll move on to the next section, and there'll certainly be more opportunity for comments or questions. So now we're going to talk about the target setting updates. And so that's the degree to which we have a separate target setting phase which is based on the means. So as we discussed before, developing the means is actually a really critical element of setting the targets. It's just that once we get the means, then we're going to be implementing another few steps and having more discussion about it. So these are kind of going in parallel. When we met at the last RAC, we got some initial input on the target setting criteria. And so I wanted to today just recap your input from the last meeting, discuss how that's shaping up, get some additional input, and then discuss next steps for the target setting, which will be the discussion that we have when we present the proposed means and targets at the next public meeting. Next slide. Next slide. I think there might be a little bit of a delay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the RAC input, we received a few. We received a few comments on some of these, so this isn't the only input we had, but we summarized it here. So the first recap is that we received input on the target criteria, and several RAC members recommended using the means as the targets because the means are the largest targets that can be used. So that's the max. It wasn't all of the RAC members, but that was kind of the direction that things were going. So just wanted to capture things here, but there are definitely future opportunities to provide more input on that, especially once you see the means and we refine the means. So that was one piece. And then another input was just confirming that the only emission reduction requirement in the bill is to, quote, seek to maximize reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. There's not it's qualitative, it's not quantitative. But we also discussed at the last RAC meeting that there are state level emissions reduction goals and emissions limits in Oregon, and certainly a lot of other considerations that are driving that qualitative goal of maximizing reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that was really what was behind the desire on the part of several RAC members to use the targets. And then another important piece of input was more of a question: how can we consider flexibility in buildings and in the EUI target setting? So one example that I believe this was basically referring to battery storage, on-site renewables, a lot of other things that can actually really improve the performance from a multifaceted perspective that may not necessarily result in a lower EUI or not a lower EUI averaged across the year. So this will be something that we'll discuss further at the next meeting, but just wanted to note that this was an important consideration. And one thing to think about with this is that, is it something that can actually be embedded in the EUI target, or is it something that is more related to alternative compliance or some sort of incentive process? It could be part of the early adopter incentive program, or it could be something even that is incorporated in some other program. So that's just a quick recap on what we've heard so far, and we'll be capturing all of your input as we go through the process. Next slide. Okay, so we identified key drivers, and we have considered the House Bill 3409 directives, and now we're in this green dot of establishing the criteria. Then we'll be assessing the targets once we have the means, and then we'll be developing the final targets. Next slide. So this is a table of the draft target setting criteria. And when we went back after we received some initial RAC input and we went through the full bill requirements, it turns out that really a lot of the target setting criteria are listed pretty directly in the bill. So we wanted to capture all of those pieces and also see if there are any additional things that RAC members want to add now. So just a quick recap, and these are the types of things where when we get the means, we'll be looking at the means and confirming that we have checked all of these boxes. And that's really how we're confirming success and rationalizing the decision on these means for the target. So it must be weather normalized net energy. So we can't be developing targets that aren't weather normalized net energy. And that's what how the EUIs will be calculated for meeting the targets. And then the targets must be equal to or greater than the mean EUIs by building type. We do know that we have the possibility of doing separate newer construction targets, but that really depends on whether or not the main targets were any higher than the mean already. And then we must include 2 or more climate zones, and we must be adjusting as necessary for unique energy using features. And so I would just say now that a lot of these energy using features are already incorporated into a lot of the means. So if you have an MRI machine and you're an inpatient hospital, that isn't really a unique energy using feature. That's kind of an inherent part of that building type, and it's assumed across thousands of buildings that that's averaging out to an adjusted amount for the buildings that have or do not have those features. This would really be for much more unique features like a particle accelerator at the University of Washington, for example, or there are a number of other kind of fascinating energy using features that came up in the Washington analysis. So then we also need to consider regional and local building energy use. So this seems like a given and we're doing that, but it is literally written into the bill. So that's a key driver for why we're doing it and why we're taking that really seriously. And then we also, to whatever degree possible, need to be excluding EV supply equipment. And that definitely goes for the EUIs that the buildings develop to meet the target. And then the main qualitative goal is maximizing greenhouse gas reductions. And that is something that we can discuss now. I think we will have a few minutes still here to get some input on this, but we might want to think about if this is qualitative in the bill, but it's quantitative in other policies and laws and executive orders in the state of Oregon. This is definitely something that the RAC could weigh in on. Are there criteria? Are there some quantitative goals that you would like to add to this? And then I added this recognize flexible loads. Maybe this is EUI target adjacent. Maybe it's not actually something in the target. And then I'd like to open it up now for any other things, any questions, like how is this feeling for everyone? Are there other things right off the bat that you think aren't covered, or does it feel like it's really feeling pretty complete? First, and I'll let you call on folks. I see one hand, but I'm not sure if they're the first one or the only one.
Yeah, the WebEx model is a bit interesting. It doesn't necessarily stack the hands in order, but Clark, I do believe you're the first hand up, so go ahead.
So on the maximize greenhouse gas emissions reductions, the qualitative piece, I think we have talked in the past, and I'm just curious if it's being considered, that we would ask people to potentially report greenhouse gas emissions so that Odo can do the calculation to validate its progress on this point, but it wouldn't at all be a part of people's meeting or not meeting the whatever their reporting requirements are in a given year. So they would be required to report it without it being at all part of the score.
Yeah, that's my understanding, and that's I'm glad you mentioned that, because for this target setting criteria, This is the criteria for determining the targets, not what the targets actually are. So this is more of a process for setting the targets. What do we want the targets to achieve? So for example, if we set the targets really high, they would be achieving a lot less reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But if we set them lower, then we're likely maximizing greenhouse gas emissions reductions depending on where we set that target, assuming we have the floor. So this is for what the targets are achieving and even on an aggregate level. So we're going to be looking at what the impact is of setting the targets at the means. What would the greenhouse gas reductions be at a state level if we were to set it at that? And what would it maybe be if it was slightly above that? So this is more of a consideration and for where the targets get set, but it's not an element of the target itself.
Agreed. Okay. And then while we're speaking, I'm just going to go ahead and +1 the recognizing flexible loads. I do think that we should have some sort of allowance calculation, some way for people to deal with the fact if they have a grid connected building or doing some other demand response thing that's positive for the grid. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, as other folks are thinking about any comments or questions they have, I think I would ask Blake. This is an interesting point of discussion. I had mentioned this EUIT adjacent, and that's partly because I was thinking that might be something to consider in setting the EUI target, since it's stipulated in the bill that it's no higher than the mean. It and it's based on net energy. I think the only way that the flexible loads really come into play, or the on-site solar, for example, comes into play, because that would be netted out. So it does consider that you could dramatically reduce your energy use intensity target by covering your roof with solar. That's one way to do it. So that is already kind of inherently considered, but I think this is really getting at something more about grid resilience and a resource to the grid in terms of timing when the energy is being used, and where in the rulemaking would that actually come into play, if it could come into play?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's really interesting discussion. I'm definitely curious, if other RAC members have some input too. And I've been kind of thinking about it as this discussion's been happening. I think, in cases of on-site generation, I think that's a little bit easier to kind of wrap your head around about how that would impact or affect a building's EUI, because, any on-site generation used on site would be netted out and would reduce a building's total energy use across the year, and then their energy use intensity compared to the target. Where I think it gets a little bit more challenging, particularly in the context of the statute and how it's based on site energy usage, not demand, but net site energy usage, are for buildings that do have some sort of a demand response capability, maybe like on-site batteries, or the ability to turn back their water heaters or space heating based on some signal from the utility. Those are all things that we're definitely really supportive of as an agency, but I do struggle to see how they might fit into within the context of the language in the statute about EUIs based on site energy usage. I don't know how you incorporate that into a site energy usage and into the target itself, when demand response capability is great from a resiliency perspective, but it doesn't always affect total energy usage. Perhaps it is, or maybe becomes part of the incentive program that's associated with this. That's an option too that we could look at when we start focusing a little bit more on that. But definitely curious and interested from other RAC members if they do see some opportunity to include it.
Well, Blake, I'll just jump in on that, and that it seems to me that at the very least, it could be a reporting requirement, kind of like has been proposed around GHG emissions, so that your Odo is now tracking buildings that have these capabilities. And even if it's not part of your data, so it's growing that way, because I think we can imagine the grid integrated buildings are going to get become a bigger player in your world over time, and they'll become a bigger player in the regulatory world over time. And if the work of this law is starting to track those changes, that seems like a plus, even if it's not part of the target.
I would
Yeah,
add a
thanks.
couple.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I think that's really a great idea, and I really agree with the relevance, especially moving forward. It's only going to become more and more relevant. There are two considerations, and maybe this is something to go back and review the law and think about how this could play out. But then also, if any of the RAC members in your feedback that you provide on the survey, if you have any additional ideas on how to incorporate this flexibility, that would be great. But the two quick things are that one, there is a way in the future to add another performance metric. So this is something that the Institute for Market Transformation has as a part of their model BPS policy design, is that you can add in the greenhouse gas metric, and then you can also, I think it's a peak, some sort of peak metric, peak energy metric. And so, but another thing where it could come into play here is that perhaps individual buildings could have a higher EUI if they wouldn't have to meet, they could meet a certain percentage higher if they met some other criteria for flexibility. And so there's potential that that authorization or the authority to do something like that exists within the current law, maybe in the rulemaking, maybe for alternative compliance, but maybe that's something that would need to be stipulated directly in some sort of new authorizing language. But that's something that that would not be going below the mean, so it would not be less than that maximum. It would actually be giving a little bit of flexibility in the mean target based on some of these other factors.
See, Alex has their hand up.
Yeah, I'm curious, is there any methodology that would allow us to model the impact on flexible load strategies to incorporate it in the UI target?
I guess I just Santiago might want to chime in on that, but I think what we would likely do is we would, with this time frame that we have here, we would likely try to draw on some other national lab data. This might be something where some studies have already been done, and there might be something that we could apply as a rationale for making that kind of, for adding that kind of flexibility in the EUI.
Just to clarify, maybe you didn't, I didn't phrase my question right. I was more thinking if a building incorporates like or utilizes load flexibility strategies, could it be modeled, this specific building? Could they say like, here's a modeling approach which allows us to, you know, our immediate UI can be slightly higher because we're offsetting it with the strategies, and this impact on these strategies building by building, right? So like offering, I guess that's what you were saying about with an alternative compliance path, that a building has some means to show the impact on their strategies that they're deploying, and they basically get the benefit.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So you're saying more on the level of an individual building that they could kind of prove that on. Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting, and that maybe combines with if we can find some other studies that show how we could actually capture that value. How would we determine what that reduction would be in the, or increase in the EUI target based on that? If there was some kind of information that we could look at there. But again, it would be something that would need to be very well vetted already, and something that we just felt really confident in leveraging because we have a short time frame. But definitely exciting ideas for how to make this more flexible.
I might just add to what Poppy just said. I think it's worthwhile to add these flexible strategies, but and there's always a but. The regional strategy for modeling efficiency and resource allocation of electricity doesn't factor a lot, or doesn't give a ton of weight to load flexibility. So in terms of a regional model available to price that accordingly and to give value to it, there's not a lot there. And then further, I might add that I think the value would be different depending on who your electrical provider is. I think there's more gas resources used in PG and Portland General Electric territory than there would be in, say, Bend, for example. A lot of those small PUDs outside of Portland depend on Bonneville wholesale electricity, which has different demand side flexibility benefits, or would have different demand side flexibility benefits. So if it's a question of the real value, then we'd have to give different weights to each of those. And then if it's a question of it being fair, it might not be fair for someone in a small PUD either, because they wouldn't be able to benefit from that. So I think it's worth considering. I just point out there's some additional challenges with both modeling and fairness there.
And just to close on that, I think that there's also a question of how we bring this back into the project at hand. So really, this project is about establishing the energy use intensity targets. And so what we're talking about here is not the targets themselves, which is what we're focusing on. It's more about how can you incentivize other goals that the state may have. And so that could show up in some flexibility in the alternative compliance. It may be something that the state looks at in the future in terms of another metric. And so I just wanted to confirm now that we can capture all of these ideas that maybe don't fit neatly within this existing project, but we can include those in a summary in the final memo that basically doesn't lose these and can be passed on to next steps if it's something that we can't do within the context of this project. So love these ideas, keep them coming. We don't want to lose any of this, because these conversations generate a lot of interesting possibilities, even if they can't be applied directly in the current project.
I just want to read out some of the comments. Oh, sorry, I don't know who I just
going to add on to that too, that the fact that the BPS program kind of calls on us to reevaluate the targets and redo rulemaking every 5 years too. So it is something, if it isn't able to be incorporated into this current process, definitely something that we can continue to look at for future iterations of the program. And then also that maybe local jurisdictions that I know are really interested in having complementary BPS programs like Portland that looks at other metrics too, could look to incorporate.
Awesome. And just wanting to make sure the comments are heard as well. So we have Clark sharing that the more we get buildings to, Clark would be supportive of a peak energy metric now or in the future. The more we get buildings to be less peaky over time, we'll have a greater and greater impact on the resiliency of the grid. And Carrie shared that in addition to understanding any flexibility capabilities, it would also be useful to understand facility peak demand and coincident peak demand. Collecting this data would be useful in thinking about building performance relative to grid needs.
Great input. So I think, unless there's anything else now, I think we can probably move on. Oh, I think I actually have one more slide, and we're doing all right on time, but we can wrap up pretty quickly. But that was a really good discussion. Just to wrap up on the targets piece, the next steps are to assess the targets. So once we get the means, we'll be assessing the mean EUIs against these target setting criteria. And these will be presented at the next meeting, which is a public meeting, and we'll also be presenting a discussion on the targets themselves. So discussing the implications of the means as the targets, and then also considering whether or not there is a rationale for changes to those, and then eventually we'll be finalizing the targets, and this will all be a part of the public process moving forward. Next slide. And then just to give you a sneak peek into the types of graphics that we're going to be showing for our target analysis, this is definitely Washington. This is not Oregon, but this is an example of what we did there. And here the means were the minimum. So that's the top bar here, the top of the bar where it's the kind of indigo blue. And what we would be showing here is the mean for the Oregon target setting, and then we would also show it with variations of where the Washington target is for existing buildings, where the Washington target is for new construction, to give a sense of where that mean is in relation to what has been established in Washington State. And then also we'll include updates on the green bars here. These hollow bars, these are actually the ASHRAE targets. And the ASHRAE targets, although the many BPS standards are based on the ASHRAE 100 in terms of an overall rulemaking document, I don't know if any are actually using the targets, because the targets are actually quite low for most, but not all building types. So we can see how much lower the ASHRAE targets actually are than even the 30%, which is the bottom of this orange bar for the newer construction for Washington State. So there's definitely a long trajectory of reductions that can and will be happening over time as a result of this BPS in Oregon, and this is just the first cycle. So this is just kind of a sneak peek for what that will start to look like when we present things at the next meeting. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand things back to Anna.
Yep, and all I'm going to do is take us home and wrap up this portion of your REC meeting. So your takeaways from today are that we, can see those EUI changes in those means from 2012 to 2018. Reminder that we are going to be sending out a survey after this call with a Friday deadline so that we can get this information compiled and put together in slides in the next 2 weeks before the public meeting. We will also make sure to provide a lot of contextual information and, as you said, demystify that. And, the target setting criteria that we went over was primarily focused on HB 3409. So they're just kind of your takeaways to take home with you. And then the next things over the next 2 weeks, that target setting, finalizing those means, and then presenting that in the public meetings over the next couple of months. A lot of the next meeting with the public meeting will be things that you have already said as we provide that context and that initial information to the public, in addition to the new information that comes from those kind of final means and where we are with the targets at that time. With that, that's all we have presentation-wise. If there are any final questions, or Blake, if you would like to get to your final agenda item, please let us know.
Yeah, I'll give folks just another opportunity to ask any other questions of the SPW team here before we move on to the next agenda item, and just kind of reiterate that I think it's, we've gotten a lot of great feedback today during the meeting, and definitely please respond to the survey that comes out to give the team the necessary information and feedback and points to help get us to the next step of creating the actual means to present during the public meeting. So that's kind of the critical take away here. Okay, I'm not seeing any other comments, so I think we can get on to the next section of the agenda, which is probably a whole lot less interesting than talking about EUIs. But we're gonna, I'm gonna pull up. I can share my screen. The let's see, there we go. And I'll make it larger too, so folks can see and zoom in. The appendix for covered building reporting requirements. So hopefully folks can see that and it's large enough. And we'll just kind of walk through these, this language here during the last part of the last 20 minutes of the meeting, and definitely feel free to add in any comments. And I'm gonna make sure I can see the attendees here too, in case somebody raises their hand. There we go, okay. So what this appendix does, and it was basically modeled after the Washington appendix, is it sets the reporting requirements for Tier 1 covered buildings and the process around actually reporting compliance. So the first section of this appendix provides the process for us as an agency providing notification to building owners that are potentially covered, and this is the process that we're going through right now to work with some of our county tax assessors to and other state building data sets to identify the buildings that are over the size thresholds, and then try to connect those with the actual building owners so that we can communicate with them. And that's something that we're in the process of doing now. So by the middle of next year, we will be sending out notifications to covered building owners. We're going to attempt and do our best to notify all the buildings that are covered, but we fully recognize that there will be some buildings that just aren't identified as part of our research and discovery process. So just the fact that we don't notify a potential covered building owner doesn't mean that they're not a covered building. So just wanted to point that part out. So as far as like general compliance pathways go, there's really, there's really kind of four pathways. General compliance has to be reported in accordance with the schedule that's in the statute, and then every 5 years after. One pathway is the weather normalized energy use intensity of the building meets the EUI targets, or it follows the investment criteria, or it has a conditional compliance, or it's exempt. One thing that I did want to kind of bring up, language that's in the Washington program, is that the EUI needs to meet the target in a period that doesn't exceed 2 years prior to the compliance deadline. One thing that I'm interested in some feedback from the RAC, like when a covered building's reporting their information, like how many years of data should we be collecting there? Should we be collecting the one compliance year, or across multiple years during the 5-year time frame? Kind of curious if there's any feedback there. Keeping in mind that reporting will be done for energy usage through Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So I see a hand from Clark.
So did you say that they would be submitting portfolio manager data every year regardless? And Odo would have that data regardless?
So I guess that's the question. How many years would we be like when they do submit? So after that, after they're like the first phase of the buildings come in 2028, would we be like, should we be asking them just for the 1 year that they comply with the standard if they're following the EUI target, meeting that, or would we want to see that trend of data across the previous 5 years, including the compliance year?
Right. Speaking for just myself, I would say it seems like there's benefits to Odo and the building owner if they have to at least document it every year, because then they would see a trend line as they approach their 5-year mark. They would know if they're leaning off target instead of waiting till the last 12 months and then finding out they've got a problem again or something. Seems like there's lots of benefits to having people just get in the cadence of annual assessment.
Yeah, thanks. Good comments. Don't know if let's see, I don't see any other hands raised, so I think we can move on. I'm just looking in there. Okay. The comments. As far as the compliance schedule, just updated the dates in there and the size thresholds to match with the Oregon statute. And then there are a number of kind of deadlines in there for conditional compliance, and these are all modeled, just closely after or exactly after the way that it's been addressed in Washington, just kind of for consistency purposes there. In terms of like applying for conditional compliance, at no later than 180 days prior to the compliance date, if that is the pathway that that would be followed. Similar sort of deadlines for applying for exemptions. So again, buildings that need an exemption would need to apply for those and be approved if they do meet one of the exemption criteria. And then as far as the exemption criteria go, that's all been updated. There's a number of exemption criteria within the statute itself. And that has to do with like not having a certificate of occupancy, physical occupancy rates under certain thresholds, if most of the space is unconditioned or semi-heated such that it's under the 35,000 square foot threshold, manufacturing and industrial spaces that meet those two building occupancy classifications, factory group F and high hazard group H are exempt. Agricultural buildings are exempt. And then there's a number of financial hardship criteria that if a building owner is able to demonstrate to us that they meet one of those criteria, they could be eligible for an exemption too. And I did notice that there was a comment on here that was a good catch in the language that I intended to update all of the financial hardship criteria to match what was in the statute, and I actually missed this one item, VI. So that item it is a little bit vague, I agree. And it came from the Washington language, and that was actually intended to be deleted too, because that one doesn't align with the Oregon statute criteria. So just know that that one would be removed in our final language. And then the majority of the rest of this appendix really just outlines the various forms, and they're called Form A, Form B, Form C, D, E, and F. But those forms really just contain the information to be supported or to be submitted to us. Like Form A is just the pathway for compliance. So if they're documenting how do they plan to comply, that's the information along with some of the other necessary just building owner information. Form B is the building activity, like what type of building it is and how they determine their target. Form C is the actual EUI calculations that they would just use for reporting through Portfolio Manager. And I'll note here too that we do intend to, like, these forms won't be like paper forms or PDF forms that we ask for. We are planning to look to a third-party software solution. There's a number of software solutions on the market. That process will take some time for us to evaluate that, just based on the scope of the project, the scope of buildings that will need to be reported, and the overall timeline, given that whatever software solution we select will hopefully be in place for the indefinite lifetime of the project. So you can imagine with the state purchasing a software with the long-term commitment, there's a number of processes and just checks that happen for that. So all of the items and criteria and building characteristics that are included in the forms that are kind of down toward the end of this document will all be part of a future electronic database submittal system. So, and then one other thing that I wanted to point out as part of this appendix is that it does include the outline for our agency's ability to provide civil penalties for non-compliance and the process around that. So the process would start with a notice of violation, provide a building owner with an opportunity to correct, and that really is the first notice. And then there's criteria for providing like a deadline for response. And then the second step of the process would be that notice of violation and intent to assess an administrative penalty. So if a building owner fails to respond or doesn't respond completely, then our agency could feasibly assess a fine, a civil penalty on that building owner. And then there's a process for, for assessing that fine if they miss the deadlines, for requesting hearings, for the penalties and for denied exemptions, and things like that. And just to remind the RAC, the maximum fine would be up to $5,000 plus $1 per square foot per year, as the maximum fine that we could assess on a building owner for a non-compliant building. There is some allowance and some amount of a reduced fine if, say, a building owner doesn't comply, they receive the notice of violation, and then they submit their non-compliance mitigation plan that's complete, but they're still not in compliance. I did like how the Washington program kind of set out a reduced penalty, not to exceed 30% of that $5,000 plus 20 cents per square foot. So less than the maximum penalty that would be assessed if the building owner is non-responsive or without complete documentation for mitigation and how they plan to get in compliance. So I did want to point that out. One item in here too that I think we'll continue to look at, that I noticed, and I think I do want to look at it a little bit more, and how this is maybe playing out in in Washington and in other jurisdictions, is this maximum threshold for the fine not to exceed a value greater than 18 months of accrued penalty. And hoping to learn a little bit more about what that means, and if we want to set similar maximum thresholds over the course of, you can imagine non-compliance for more than a year, more than 2 years, more than 3 years, if there's some kind of a maximum, maximum fine, maximum months of accrued penalty that we'd want to put in there, or if it could be just a continually increasing penalty over the years based on non-compliance too. So if there's any comments on that, definitely interested. See, I don't think I'm seeing any hands raised. So, and that mostly covers everything that's in, other than there's a hearing process and, some of those just other administrative processes that would apply if a building owner receives a fine and wants to contest it. So, Kara, I see a hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. Blake, just wondering how much you maybe talked internally about the penalties. How did you land on what would be appropriate? Because while we want to penalize folks for not complying, there is a little bit of a where is the appropriate line to draw. So just curious how much you discussed internally where to set that line.
Yeah, so the fine amounts themselves are established in statute. The $5,000 plus $1 per square foot. Those are legislatively established. I think we haven't yet, as part of these rules, we would lay out the process for providing that notice of violation, and as far as like implementation and actual like bringing fines against building owners, I don't think the ideal situation for anybody is being fined, right? We'd want to obviously see every building in compliance. We want to help support building owners getting to compliance. I think it's kind of the last resort, as a way to ensure that there is at least some effect of non-compliance to make sure that building owners just don't completely ignore the requirements. And in the event that we do find somebody, I think our plan would be to then reinvest the money that we get, reinvest that in energy efficiency at other building locations. So that's something that we'll continue to look at as actual program implementation comes into place, like when we would actually reach the point of issuing a fine. And I think there's definitely sensitivities that would be built in there. Yeah. I see a question from Daniel about Z 5.4.3 needing a statutory or rule citation. Let's see where that is. Oh. That's something we can look into. Yeah, I'll have to ask others about that. Thanks for that. And let's see, with that, I don't see any more hands raised or comments in there right now, but definitely feel free to provide any comments back. And we're just about at the end of the meeting, so I think now we can just take time to, I'll stop sharing my screen, and just kind of talk about next steps. So we really only have one more rulemaking advisory committee meeting scheduled for 2 weeks, for September 4th. And in that, it would just be kind of a wrap up of all the work that we've done today. So, up till now, we've really worked through all of the chapters of Standard 100. We've worked through the investment criteria appendix, and we've worked through the reporting appendix. So it'll be kind of just like a wrap up summary of everything that the RAC's done, another opportunity to provide input if anything else comes to mind in between now and then. And then we'll have our broad public meeting a week later on September 11th, where the primary purpose of that meeting will be to present the main EUIs, and then also provide an overview of the RAC activity and the Oregon modifications to Standard 100 that we've made since the previous public meeting. So we worked through chapters 1 through 6, gave the public a preview and an opportunity to provide comment on those in the last public meeting. And then in this next one, we'll again provide the public with an early opportunity to look at chapters 7 through 9, and then these two appendices, the investment criteria and then the reporting requirements and process in that next one. And then that all leads up to our finalizing of the draft rules for publishing with the Oregon Secretary of State by the end of September. They'll be open for general public comment during the month of October and early November. And then we'll hold our formal public hearing in mid-November. So, one thing I also did want to bring up to you here too, that Kara mentioned. So will we see the draft rules updated with the feedback from RAC members that you found most compelling? So I think that is one thing that we do plan to incorporate. So we've been kind of taking the RAC feedback as we go, making updates in real time if we can to the draft rules. And then we'll also consolidate the RAC feedback. And as part of the process, we do hope to kind of consolidate the general areas that we got feedback from the RAC and how or if those were addressed in the rules. I would love to have continual feedback, like another, more RAC meetings through the end of the year, but there is, we will need to put these out for public comment, and I would certainly encourage the RAC to also engage in the public part of the process too. So just because like the RAC part of the process isn't, is nearing completion, there's certainly more opportunities for RAC member input as part of the public process too. And, if there is the desire from the RAC to maybe hold like a separate like RAC meeting to talk about more like specific RAC input during the public comment period, I think we're open to something like that too. So, but to respond to the comment, yes, we do plan to kind of, even if they're not like responses to individual RAC members' comments, we'll kind of group the general comments together and then provide a response for how we address those in the rules. Yeah. Okay, with that, we're just right about at time. So let's see, let me make sure I don't see any other hands raised at this point, unless I'm missing one. No. So with that, thanks a lot for your input today. Great discussion on the EUI analysis. Really excited for the next round and the next step there during our September 11th public meeting. And in the meantime, feel free to send me any comments, and do look for that survey later on today, and do provide feedback there if you want. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day.